Hi guys, I'm Chris.
And I'm Mike.
And welcome back to this week's No Limits, a Mid-Trab podcast. So how you doing?
I'm good, man. Watched a couple of movies and documentaries to get ready for this pod, so kind of excited about it. A lot of good things to recommend to the listeners at the end of this one. How about you? What's up?
Yeah, this pod was a lot easier to prep for than reading half a book and in-depth analysis, trying to come up with themes, you know. I like when we do these.
Yeah. Well, you had a good idea for next month, the movie review, something related to executive power. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I forget
Cool.
what it is, though, right now. I have it written down.
I remember what it was. Yeah, cool. We'll announce that a little closer to November when we're going to roll out executive power in a couple of weeks.
Yes.
Cool. Well, today's episode, as you hopefully heard last week, is related to one of the most well-known special operations missions in history, hostage rescue, performed by the Israeli Defense Forces back in 1976. To give a little Twitter shout-out here, I first learned about this event, Operation Thunderbolt, from Jack Carr. He posted about it. Yes, he posted about it back in late June or early July, which was the anniversary of the operation. And he had a picture of a vehicle in the back of a C-130 with a bunch of soldiers kind of hanging off of it. And he's like, anybody know why Israeli Special Forces with a Mercedes limousine were in the back of this plane in July 1976?
Oh, I remember that post. Yeah.
Yep. And so I started reading about it. I was like, man, this is pretty cool. And then when we read Separation of Power, and Rap is dropping into Baghdad in these helicopters carrying a Mercedes limousine, impersonating Saddam's troops, I was like, man, that's what Jack Carr was talking about. And I started putting the pieces together, and this mission really reminded me of the book a little bit. So
yeah, I sort of came from it the opposite, whereas you had mentioned it while we were recording or while we were prepping for our Separation of Power episode. You're like, all right, well, let's go read. Let's look up some stuff, and then there's a documentary. There's been 2 dramatizations of this, and let's see what you were sort of asking me. Do I think that ask the listeners as well? Do you think that there's any sort of inspiration that Vince would have drawn from this? And I think clearly, once we get into it, you'll see that obviously he probably is inspired by a lot of different missions, but there's a lot of parallels between this mission and directly our favorite mission in Separation of Power. So it's pretty cool to do a deep dive, look at some history. So yeah, excited to talk about that today.
Let's do it. And before we get going, just a huge thank you to our patrons. As we've been saying for a while now, we could not keep this podcast going without you guys. You are the reason for weekly shows. And to thank you, we're running the October book giveaway. So next week on the show, we'll be announcing the winner. Gives you some time to sign up, become a patron, help out with the show. And if you are the winner, you can pick a signed copy of any of these 6 books: Executive Power, Extreme Measures, Pursuit of Honor, Act of Treason, Protect and Defend, or The Survivor.
Yes, and we just need to remind you that we're pretty excited. We're going to be able to donate all of the next 2 months Patreon dues or funds to the Prostate Cancer Foundation. So, if you sign up for that now, you could get into that donation. We're happy to say that we have contacted the Prostate Cancer Foundation, told them about our donation. They've actually agreed to come on to the podcast next month and tell us about their longstanding partnership to bring cutting-edge treatments and prostate cancer clinical trials to many different veterans. So we're excited about that. We're also going to be able to do in the next month interview with our next philanthropic endeavor with Operation Paperback. So
yes,
stay tuned for those podcasts. We're excited to share those with you.
Yeah, we're really happy to give back. So we just hope the Patreon funding can continue to cover our operating costs. But beyond that, we are going to be giving back to causes related to veterans issues and both reading. So we found a really good charity for next year so that the Patreon giving can continue. let's get into it then. Let's talk Operation Thunderbolt and try to draw parallels between the real-life special operation completed and conducted by the Israeli Defense Forces and what Vince wrote about in Separation of Power.
Right, so I was thinking we could break this episode into 3 parts. 1, we recap, obviously, our inspiration from this month. We're talking about Separation of Power, the book we just reviewed. Recap that Baghdad scene. Next, we could sort of recap the actual Operation Thunderbolt, Operation Entebbe, our research, what we did into it. Maybe we can, obviously discuss the parallels we think we see between the two. And then also, Mike and I did a little bit of not a deep dive, but a medium dive into a couple of different movies, both documentary and dramatizations that cover this topic. And we're going to give you our, what we liked, what we didn't like, zero-sum game. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess probably a good idea to give a spoiler alert.
I mean, it's history, so...
If it's historical fact, I don't know if you could still call it a spoiler alert. So obviously the films we get to at the end, we recommend, but like any good historical narrative, knowing the ending doesn't change an enjoyable film or the art and enjoyment of it. So even if you know the mission, it's still really great we're not spoiling any of the films because they are still in themselves great works of art that we recommend, but hopefully you'll go into them being informed about some of the real history that we were able to uncover.
Yeah, it's like in Argo, you know that they were going to succeed, but Argo was still a good movie. Or I remember watching Rogue One, and after 2 of the people died, it clicked. I was like, oh wait, everyone's going to die. Because I remembered that line from episode 4 where it was like everyone died trying to get these plans.
But the plans still get out there, right?
Yeah,
they don't
exactly.
fail at communicating the plans.
No, so it still was a good movie. So that's our point,
Absolutely. Well, Separation of Power. Let me kick us off with the opening of Chapter 43. That's pretty much where the mission is happening. So Rapp and the crew have uncovered that Saddam Hussein in Iraq is only months away from having operational nuclear weapons. Colonel Gray is brought in, and the president only wants to go with this risky mission if he can get Rapp involved. Well, here's Rapp kicking off the mission. So Vince writes, quote, "The 4 helicopters knifed their way through the cooling desert air like a snake slithering across the sand. They were not flying in a straight route. Instead, a predetermined course had been plugged into the Chinook's advanced navigation systems, allowing them to avoid all villages, major roads, and Iraqi radar sites. Cruising at just 100 feet off the desert floor, with only 300 feet between each chopper, and flying at speeds of over 120 miles per hour, there was no room for error." I just like that description of the choppers flying. He gets the distances between them, distances off the ground, and how they're avoiding detection flying over the Iraqi desert. So I love that stuff.
Yeah, I think even from that little passage, we could draw a bunch of parallels to what went on in Operation Thunderbolt. But we'll say that
exactly.
Later.
We'll save that for a minute. But we have an almost similar description of real life helicopters doing that across the sea instead of the desert. Yeah, airplanes. Yep.
But so this wasn't their first mission. This wasn't their first idea, right? They had been in the Situation Room. They had been at the Pentagon. The president, Flood, and his advisors had been figuring out a way how to get to the president, or how to get to Iraq and get to these nukes. Initially, it was just bombing. The idea of bombing it in, using an even more deep penetration bomb. They could fly, airmen across, or they could drop boots on the ground. And then finally they come up with this harebrained, crazy scheme using knowledge that they know that Saddam's son and Saddam himself ride around Iraq in these white limos. And, our theme from last time was you have to, decisiveness, that's the word, sorry. By using the knowledge of these white limos and being decisive, they're going to take advantage of that and sort of masquerade around as Saddam or his son. They're coming in. They got to quickly drop the white Mercedes limo, get in. The bombing is supposed to be coordinated to give them cover, get the nuke, and then get out. And all while
Yeah.
our boy Mitch Rapp is playing none other than Saddam's son, right? So
Yep. Well, before they drop off the limo, because I think, Chris, you're going to see a parallel when we get to Operation Thunderbolt. Here's the description of the landing. So, the Mercedes sedan was secured to the floor of the chopper with 4 high-test tie-downs. One of the Delta operators was sitting behind the wheel, ready to back it out as soon as they hit the ground. The 3 gunners were all wearing flight helmets with night vision goggles and comlinks, so they could tell the pilot and the navigator what they saw. He couldn't see out the window, but he knew what was going on. It had all been covered in the briefing. The Air Force STS team had prepped the landing strip in the parking lot of the abandoned factory and set up 4 equally spaced infrared strobe lights that could not be seen by the naked eye, but through the night vision goggles, and they were bright as a lighthouse's beacon. All 4 behemoths would touch down within seconds of each other. So in Operation Thunderbolt, dealing with the lights on the runway at nighttime in Uganda, Central Africa, is going to be a big issue. So we see Vince here having an Air Force advance team light the landing zone for the choppers, and just wait till we talk about Thunderbolt. We're going to see a team prepared to light the runway in the middle of the night, and that's going to be a big part of the success of the operation.
Yeah, Vince goes on. I think there's I'm blanking on which actual. It might be Active War. I forget which one it is, but he uses these little like cube infrared strobes pop up in a couple of the stories, and I'm thinking of one scene where I think Mitch is in Afghanistan, and the Taliban come, and he only has one of these, and they run on like a small little like 9-volt battery or something like that. Like, this is pretty cool technology.
Yeah,
it must be one of the like more recent books, but yeah, this is the kind of thing that's going to pop up throughout various missions that Mitch Rapp goes on.
Yep.
This is almost like the ideal situation that I'm guessing Operation Thunderbolt would have wanted to do instead of what they had to do.
Yeah. Because just a few more details on that, they are landing at an abandoned chemical weapons facility that the U.S. had already bombed out. And so this was kind of like a safe zone that they knew was empty. And it's 20 minutes outside Baghdad. So Vince writes that they get the limo out of the helicopter in 5 seconds, and the Delta boys are ready to go. And one of the guys says, 20 minutes to Baghdad, then the real fun starts. Well, in the mission, they're not going to have a 20-minute drive from the landing zone. They're going to come in hot almost. So little difference there. But you're right about, you mentioned Rapp and our theme of, you got to have confidence. You got to know your enemy, know yourself, and you have to show this confidence. So Rapp is wondering, what advice does he give some of the guys he's with right before they land? And he tells them, be bold, be arrogant, and if anybody gets in the way, threaten to kill them. This is the way Uday would do it. He had learned from his father, and young Uday had bested him. Saddam had no heart, but it seemed at least there was some logic to his use of force. It was used to rule, to keep his subjects cowering. And so Rapp knows, if you go in there and you mean business, and you look like you're playing the role, the soldiers will cower and let you pass right through. They'll give you whatever you want. So that's the mission here.
Yeah.
And it works. They get in. A couple of different guard posts let them through. They can drive right up to the hospital and secret bunker. And Rapp's disguise works so well, he gets them to take him down into the bunker and let him leave with the nuke.
Yeah, all in all, a pretty successful mission. Besides, I think they have one little hiccup with the bombing starts too soon. But this is sort of the ideal situation that you would want to come in, obviously have highly trained people flying your helicopters, drop at a location that's sort of out of sight. They come into town, they play the part, they act like they own the place, they get in, get out,
Get it done. That's it.
Now, not quite what happens in Operation Thunderbolt.
Yeah, let's get to it.
So this is a real mission, obviously, that took place in 1976 in late June and early July. It all starts with a Air France flight 139 from Tel Aviv that was going to Paris, with a stop off in Athens, right? In all of our findings, the Athens at the time was sort of a very leaky in terms of their security. I believe there was strikes going on, so
Yep.
They didn't necessarily have like the top-notch people at manning the metal detectors and stuff like that. An X-ray, very inattentive. So that allowed the people from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine to get 4 people. Was it 4 or 6?
I think it was 4 on the plane.
4 on the
If
plane.
I'm not mistaken. The two. So there were the two
Germans.
They were like a gang or like a German crew that got in bed with the Palestinians, basically freedom fighters. They thought they were. They called themselves like a Che Guevara group, so they had more of this like liberation ideology, and so that's why the Palestinian cause really played with them. I think it was more of this communist revolutionary flair.
I couldn't find much on.
But,
I tried to like look more into them, but I couldn't find much on them.
Yeah. One of the movies makes it look like one of the guys is a bookseller. I don't know if that's in the dramatization because booksellers are always communists in Frankfurt, Germany, or Munich, wherever they are. But yeah. Anyway, these 2 Germans get in bed with the Palestinians and the PLFP to hijack the flight. There's a really good, actually, all the films, even the 2 dramatizations we're going to talk about. We had one more old school from, I believe it was made
1977.
I think it was 77. I think it was right after the events of this. They made a film about it, which was actually really powerful. And then even the more modern one from 2018, I thought pulled off the hijacking of the plane scene really well.
Don't anyone speak! Don't move. This is a live grenade. The pin is out. If anyone tries anything, if anyone touches me, I've only to drop it, and I won't hesitate to do it.
I will shoot! Everybody quiet. Don't anybody move. Sit down. I said sit down. Sit down.
They pull the pins on grenades. They pull out their handguns. The lady gets everyone to move all the passengers to one section of the plane to watch them, collect their documents, passports, and ID cards, which are going to play a role later on of why the terrorists want the passports of the hostages. Meanwhile, another guy barges into the cockpit and basically tells the pilots where to go.
Attention, everyone. Attention. We represent the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Che Guevara Group, Gaza Brigade. We're now in complete control of this flight. I am your new commander.
What should we do?
This plane is renamed Haifa. You are our prisoners. Follow our orders and no one will be killed. Panic, and you'll all be killed.
They first land in Libya, and they're hoping that Muammar Gaddafi would give them some refuge and let them stay at the airport and be an ally. Turns out Gaddafi says, "What the hell are you doing here?" Lets them refuel, but tells them they can't stay. He doesn't want to get caught up in all that. And while they're in Benghazi, a passenger fakes a miscarriage. And I found out this was real from history, not just in the films, but one of the passengers claims she's 4 months pregnant, she's feeling sick, and she thinks she's having a miscarriage. And the terrorists actually, being these revolutionaries, they make sure she's not a Jew. And once they realize she is not Israeli, they show some sympathy and let her get off the plane. Well, the terrorists just committed one of their first mistakes because
they make a series of mistakes
yeah.
That's going to lead to their downfall.
Yeah. One of the movies, though, makes it because they do sympathize and they don't want to hurt people. Yes, they believe in their cause of Palestinian liberation. Mm-hmm. But one of the newest movie really made it look like they were also human, trying to look out for the passengers. Really, you almost felt they didn't want to hurt them. Well, why would you take them hostage and open a grenade on a live plane if you don't want to hurt anybody? You're kind of crazy. But anyway, they let her go, and she ends up getting debriefed by Scotland Yard. The British are going to get some good intel on how many terrorists there are, their descriptions, and that's going to play a big role in organizing the takedown, because the British obviously share that intelligence with Mossad.
Right, and so they went to Libya because of Gaddafi and his sympathy for them. But was that what was their ultimate original destination? Was it Uganda?
So it's kind of murky, but all signs point to the plan was to get to Uganda in the end anyway.
Okay.
And Libya was either to just refuel, that was their game plan the whole time, or it was a diversion to make it look like nobody was willing to take them. But it turns out there's pretty solid evidence that Idi Amin, the dictator of Uganda, with a very terrible history of coming to power in the country, slaughtering, some say, up to 300,000 of his countrymen when he seized power, known as one of the worst dictators throughout history, essentially, in sub-Saharan Africa. There's pretty strong evidence that the Palestinians had him in their pocket the whole time. The Palestinians had crews armed, ready to booby trap and control the airport in Entebbe. Amin was in it from the beginning. He tried to sell the world on this narrative of, I told the Palestinians to come here so that I could work out peace between the two. The evidence does point to him having some pre-planning.
The documentary on Nat Geo made it seem that he actually was just pissed off at Israel because of they wouldn't help him with one of his raids that he wanted to do, right?
Maybe, but I also think it was an arms sale deal that went south.
Yeah, and also like he wanted some weapons and that they wouldn't give it to him.
Yeah, so after that incident, which was just 4 years prior, the Israelis backed out of an arms sale. He wanted some really heavy equipment, and I believe the Israelis found out he was buying it to hurt Kenya, which is a Western ally, and so they pulled out of the deal. And Amin closed Israeli diplomatic missions in Uganda. He pulled out of any business dealings because there were a lot of architecture companies and engineering firms working on Ugandan infrastructure.
Yeah, they're actually the ones who built the airport.
And that's another one of the terrorist mistakes. They hold the hostages in an airport that was built by an Israeli architecture firm. And so the Israelis have the blueprints the whole time. Yeah. Exactly. So that was another misstep. But so Idi Amin was mad at the Israelis, but here's something interesting. When he met the hostages, which we're going to talk quite a bit about, the first reaction when some of the older Israelis saw him, they cheered. They really thought he welcomed them to his country and he liberated them and kind of convinced the Palestinians to end their game. And so they cheered for him, thinking he was still an Israeli ally, people who hadn't read up on the most recent history of him closing the missions and kicking Israel out of Uganda.
Yeah. And so they're not just these 4 terrorists are there, but there are other Palestinians that come and join. And they're in the old terminal at this Entebbe Airport. Initially, they start with a ultimatum, right?
Yeah.
And so they want a bunch of people, specifically 2 different people released from prison. Do you remember the names of the people that?
Well, it's larger than just that.
Okay.
There are 2 main ones that they want. One is the Archbishop.
Right, the Archbishop. Yep.
Yeah, he sold weapons and was involved in a lot of trafficking. And another Japanese guy who was on the Palestinian cause, but they were being held either in Israel or Israel's allies. I think a lot of them were in France. That's why they chose an Air France flight, because France was holding a lot of these detainees. And so the terrorists initially demand to release 53 terrorists held in the West and $5 million from the French government for reparations. And it's a 48-hour deadline. So I believe this was on Tuesday, and they're giving them till Thursday, or else they say they're going to start killing hostages.
And at this point, they've already separated the Jews from the Westerners, right?
Yeah, this was what most have said was the most emotional moment of the whole thing. Not even the fear of being taken and seeing the weapons waved in your face. Most people, even including Shimon Peres, who was the defense minister, trying to convince the Israeli cabinet to take action this whole time, he even said it was the most emotional experience when the Jews were called out by name and the terrorists had taken their passports. And apparently this is a huge word in the Hebrew language and Israeli consciousness, separating or the separating. It's a word that evokes very deep scars and wounds from the Holocaust. And so the Ugandan soldiers broke a hole in the wall, and in some closet in a broken open wall, they hid, I think it was close to 100, 70 or 80 of the Israeli passengers in a small cramped room in a broken wall, and called them out one by one. And everyone quickly knew Jew is being separated from Gentiles, and that was not. And some of the passengers, actually, one old lady even had the tattoos from a concentration camp. A lot of them survived or had family members that survived concentration camps, and here they are reliving that experience in Uganda.
Wow, that's crazy. To be able to get out of that and then to be put into this,
right,
is insane and sickening.
Yep.
I forgot to mention this earlier. One thing I thought was interesting from the one documentary was there was on the flight some high-ranking Israeli military official or political official, I forget which one, but he had like his card on him, and they knew that if they had seen them, then he probably they'd kill him right away or do something bad to him. So they actually, his family ate and chewed up his identification card.
Wow. So
that way he wouldn't be able to, and then they were able to quickly put like the wads of paper into a Coke can. I thought that was really cool. The thing to do that.
Like even just the emotions of hiding your identity. So that's something that in the movies, I think I didn't like. One movie has, the older one, the 1977 one, has the scene where two Jewish like teenagers both hide their Star of David necklaces so that the terrorists won't see them. And while it's powerful, I think the thing about like hiding your identity with chewing up the ID in the Coke can was much more real and crazy. But It was like a quick scene in the movie to kind of bring out that same idea.
But they're going to check their passports and see that they're Israeli, right? So
true, yeah. But then the modern one took it a little too far because it was probably the most glaring ahistorical moment. They actually accused one of the passengers of being an Israeli spy and kind of beat him and took him away and interrogated him and bloodied him up. Where in real life, I don't think the terrorists were actually that cruel in terms of physical abuse and punishment to the passengers. But the movie, of course, needed, a beating or some blood and gore. And so they actually beat the crap out of this guy, they suspect. To me, that was a little bit forced just for the drama. But what can you do?
Yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah. Well, the deadline's coming. So They have until Thursday. Throughout this whole time, if this was one of the craziest scenes, Idi Amin keeps coming to make appearances, and he almost acts as if he's the savior of the people. He comes in and announces in this one really just very creepy scene in the old movie. He starts laughing. The whole time he's laughing. "Welcome to Uganda. I am His Excellency, Field Marshal Dr. Idi Amin, Dada, appointed by God Almighty to be your savior." And he's saying shalom over and over, shalom, shalom. He's laughing. At one point, he grabs one of the young little boys and just laughs like it's this weird laugh of joy. He's trying to tell them, "I'm going to free you." And then he's scaring them. It's like these psychological games. You could tell how messed up he is. And meanwhile, he has control of a couple of hundred soldiers at his fingertips right there guarding the building. And it just shows how mental he is. And I'm like, if you're not scared by, Germans, two German hijackers and a group of Palestinians separating Jew from Gentile, now you got to worry about a crazy off-the-rails dictator saying shalom to you with a funny laugh, like telling you, "I'm appointed by God to be your savior."
For those of you who do not know me, I'm Field Marshal President for life, Dr. Idi Amin Dada, the ruler of Uganda. I want to welcome you all to Uganda. I shall do everything within my power to make your stay a pleasant one here. I have arranged with the Palestinians to have you removed from the plane to these more comfortable surroundings. I will provide food and other needs the best way possible. I want to conclude this whole episode quickly. The Palestinians are fair and just people. I myself, when visiting Damascus, saw how well they treated the Jews there. I went to a synagogue. So make yourself comfortable here. But please, and this is very important. This is very important. Do not try to escape. Do not try to escape. as the Palestinians have wired explosives all around the buildings. Huh? This is very important. In the meantime, look at me as your host. I shall arrange for your release as soon as possible. Huh? Look at Uganda as your home. Shalom, shalom.
Right. So for this exercise, because this is Idi Amin, I rewatched parts of The Last King of Scotland, which is obviously, a movie about him. And, the title of that movie, The Last King of Scotland, is, you know why it's called that, right?
I actually don't remember it very much.
Oh, because he just liked to call himself titles. Like you just read, he just would give himself titles. So because in the movie, obviously played by James McAvoy, is the Scottish doctor, and the good thing he's Scottish because he has a problem with the English at the moment. So he loves Scotland, and so he just decides does Scotland have a king anymore? So, I'm going to be the king of Scotland. So he just had a knack or a habit of giving himself these crazy titles. That movie is really good. I highly recommend it.
Okay.
There actually is it is a portion of the movie. This whole Entebbe Operation Thunderbolt is in it very briefly
referenced.
Yeah, but it's interesting, this dynamic between this doctor and this crazy dictator. So
yeah. Well, thankfully, behind the scenes, the French government is working to make an arrangement because, being an Air France flight, there are a lot of French nationals on the plane, and they do successfully negotiate the release of 47 French passengers, and that could include the pilot and the crew because they are French and not Israeli. Well, the pilot rallies his crew and says, guys, this is our plane, this is our business, and they take a stand and decide to stay, in showing solidarity with the Jewish passengers. But at least 47 others are released. They are sent off. Obviously, they get debriefed immediately for what information they can tell about where they're being held, blueprints of the airport, if anything's been changed, what the conditions are, how many soldiers, etc. And so that's another time that the Israelis get critical intelligence to be able to plan any sort of rescue mission. But they only have 24 hours, essentially. So the French passengers come home. People quickly realize none of the Jews were released. They know exactly what's going on here. Yeah, and so they fly home to France, and this whole time, what are you going to do with the deadline coming to a close? And the big question is, do the Israelis break longstanding tradition and decide to negotiate with terrorists?
And meanwhile, this was highlighted in the documentary that you have the family of these people raging to, you need to negotiate, you need to negotiate, you need to negotiate, you need to negotiate. And ultimately they decide not to negotiate, right?
Yeah, I think it was Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. It was very against it at first, but when they're getting down to the wire, and the families actually storm into, I believe it was his office.
They storm into his office.
They protest. They overthrow guards, and they say, you must negotiate. These are lives we're talking about. In the end, I think you could say they caved and decided to negotiate. But one thing they did is they had a Israeli general who trained in Uganda. He actually trained some of Idi Amin's forces. He was on good personal terms with him. So they tried to get him on the phone. And it turns out this was true. Somebody had the idea to play to his ego, and he said, I know him. I know he's an egomaniac. So on the phone, he tries to convince him, hey, we don't want to negotiate with the terrorists, but you can get the upper hand here. You and the Ugandan army can take control of the situation. Why are you being played by 6 Palestinians? They shouldn't control you and your decisions. And they actually tell Amin, hey, you can come out on top of this. You might even win the Nobel Peace Prize if you decide to free the hostages, because your soldiers outnumber the Palestinians. And Amin's like, the Palestinians wired the place. They're not in control of me. I can control my own destiny. But ultimately, that conversation gets Amin and the terrorists to agree to extend the deadline.
Right.
Till Sunday.
Good news. Good news. I have gotten the Palestinians to agree to extend the deadline on negotiations for 3 more days until Sunday, July 4th. Negotiations have failed up to now because of Israeli stubbornness. But I continue to try. I go now to Mauritius, to the Organization of African Unity, to take up the plight of the Israeli hostages. You all know I want to help them. But their position is very dangerous unless the Israeli government accepts the terms of the Palestinians. I'm even using the offices of my good Israeli friend, Colonel Bar-Liv, to help them.
I beg your pardon, President Amin.
Madam, what do you do?
I'm just a grandmother, but
I am His Excellency Al-Hajij, Field Marshal, Dr. Idi Amin Dada, holder of the Victoria Cross, ESO MC, ruler of the state of Uganda, and appointed by God Almighty to be your savior.
And this is what allows, the whole time, obviously the military intelligence has been trying to think of a plan. And it's this extending of the deadline that really allows them to come up with a viable option that there's never going to be able to, diplomatically, politically release the prisoners. So we have to come up with a plan. It's Perez, right? Perez was the guy, and
the defense minister.
He was waiting, and at the time, one of the head people who were involved was Netanyahu.
Yoni Netanyahu is going to lead the mission. I don't know if he was involved in the planning aspects, but Shimon Peres, as defense minister, is really pushing Rabin in the cabinet to approve some sort of rescue operation. He doesn't care what it is. And eventually, one of the advisors say, we don't have any viable plans. And he says, well, give me the plan you don't have yet. And that's when they say, well, we got something cooking, but it's kind of a risk. And Perez is he's all in on it. And he immediately brings it to the prime minister and the cabinet, and they make mock-ups of the situation, and having the blueprints from the Israeli firm and having the released hostages tell you where everyone's being held and where they're stationed, they're able to complete a mock-up. And remember, they only have till Sunday, 8 a.m., so we're down to less than 3 full days. Yoni Netanyahu is tapped, and he had some experience. He is the younger brother of, or I forget if he was older or younger, of Bibi Netanyahu, the current prime minister and long-standing prime minister.
Yeah, so this is what we now know is codename Operation Thunderbolt, where they're going to take C-130s that have to travel 2,500 miles, sort of using the similar tactic that Mitrap used. They know that there's these black Mercedes that the Ugandan generals and Idi Amin drive around in. Again, they know that if you just act the part and that they will let you through. That it's very common to just have someone show up to do an inspection and they just drive on through. So they're going to use that to their advantage. They also know that they're in there's 2 terminals. They're in the old terminal, so the actual runway is a little bit of a distance away from where they would have to mount an attack. The plan is to land. Originally, they're not sure if the runway is even going to be lit, which is kind of like freaking crazy. This pilot just is willing to land the C-130 blind. One plane's going to land, drop the black Mercedes. Meanwhile, there's other C-130s that are carrying, I think, 200 or 250 more support people that are going to stay behind. And the goal is to drive on up, take the place by force, and release the hostages.
The key to the 3-pronged attack is the first column's ability to reach the terminal with the element of surprise still intact. Because seconds can mean the difference between a successful mission and the slaughter of the hostages. Inside the terminal, no matter what the provocation, do not use your hand grenades. Rely on your weapon. Fire short bursts. And once control is established, hold your fire to a minimum. Well, that's all. In 1 hour, we'll have a dress rehearsal. Yanni will answer any questions.
Sammy.
This is a lot like the Sabina rescue at the Tel Aviv airport. Now, as I see it, the problem will be identifying the hijackers from the hostages instantly.
Right. So we've prepared identikits on each of the terrorists. The data comes from over 100 debriefings that intelligence ran on the freed hostages in Paris and from our agents in Entebbe. Study these faces carefully. Get to know them by reflex. The terrorists must be recognized instantly. If they have time to turn on the hostages, our whole mission will be a disaster.
Yeah. And thinking back, let's start drawing parallels here to the Mitch Rapp story. When they land the helicopters, these guys set up the infrared, night vision sensors to see the landing zone. Well, the Israelis were ready in case the runway lights were off. They had lights that they were going to plant along the runway. And so what happened was they found out a British Airways flight was scheduled to land in the middle of the night simply for refueling and then continue on. And they knew by protocol the runway lights would stay on for 15 minutes after that British Airways flight. They also saw this as a good chance to confuse any radar, which they were probably trying to jam anyway, but just in case, if they knew one plane was landing, maybe they can slip in behind it. So within a few minutes of this British Airways plane coming down, the first C-130 lands and the runway lights are still on. Just in case, a couple of guys plant lights along the runway. If the lights go off, the backup and the rescue crew in the second and third C-130 can still land, and that's what happens. As the operation is going on with the limo and the Jeeps, which already took off towards the old terminal, because the element of surprise is key, the second C-130 lands, and immediately when they touch down, the runway lights go off. So thankfully, the crew had thought ahead to place these lights. Now, so we do have Yoni Netanyahu leading the mission, and he actually was wounded. I thought this was pretty cool. Previously in the 6-Day War, he was actually 30% disabled with some nerve damage, but he was still promoted to command an anti-terrorism unit and, lead the group. So he is in the limo with his crew, and they see guards. This gets pretty exciting, Chris, right? When they see the first two guards.
Yeah, sorry, let me just go back. There's another parallel. So when they're flying from Israel to Uganda, and they're surrounded by sort of people that aren't diplomatically
hostile territory.
Hostile territory. So they have to actually fly the length of the Red Sea, like 100 feet over, essentially like getting out of radar. The whole time, these C-130s are flying just right above the water, down the length of this Red Sea in order to not, because they can't go on the one side of Saudi
Arabia. Can't go over Egypt. Yeah.
Can't go over Egypt. So
they have to get to Kenya, which is way south, and then cut across Kenya.
Right. I thought that was crazy when they were describing that. Like, that was really cool. So one of the things that the documentary was sort of highlighting was that one of the guys, you mentioned the guy who had trained Ugandans, he had sort of known this information of they're going to actually raise the weapon to you, and that's like a form of okay, you can proceed, like essentially like a salute.
Saluting almost, yeah.
But apparently Yoni, the way the documentary said is that Yoni disagreed with this and decided to take them out anyways. And I'm like, if you know this guy knows the Ugandan practices, like Mitch Rapp would have known all this information and conveyed that, be like, listen, dude, do not kill anybody.
He would have had discipline among his troops.
Yeah, that's I think the one thing I could critique this mission is the sometimes the lack of discipline they had. I mean, it's a crazy mission, so
Right.
I would never be able to do it, but just like that, when I'm thinking about like where some of these things went wrong, like for the terrorists, the three things that they did wrong were: one, releasing anybody that could give information. So first, they make the first mistake by releasing the single lady. Second, they fail to realize that the airport has been built by Israelis, so probably they were going to have the operation or the blueprints. And third, they release other people who obviously can give intel.
And extended the deadline. Those extra 3 days were enough to give the Israelis time to prep the mission.
Right. So in terms of Israelis, the mistakes, this is one of the first mistakes they make, is by not trusting, the information that their man gives, order the taking out of the guards.
Yeah. And I mean, so the movies show this, and I again don't know exactly the historical fact. There's apparently a really complete book, almost like the anthology on this mission, by Saul David, Operation Thunderbolt, Flight 139 and the Raid on Entebbe Airport, the most audacious hostage rescue mission. So, I mean, that would be a really cool book to check out, but at least the movies make it look like this. So they're 100 meters from the terminal. So imagine you still have a football field to go in the middle of the night, and you're kind of undercover pretending to be a dictator's general, and you see two Ugandan soldiers. Well, the movies make it look like the special ops guys in the lead limousine had that discipline, and they waited until they were right up close. They saw this salute, and that's when they shot with silenced weapons, and they used silenced pistols to take down the guards. However, it was behind them in the jeeps that the other soldiers with machine guns that were not silenced saw the guys on the ground and decided to still put a bullet in them, thought one of them was still moving and not dead and might call for support. So he shoots with a machine gun 100 meters from the terminal, and they're going 40 kilometers an hour. That's what kind of causes them to lose the element of surprise. And so the guards collapse. This breaks the silence of the night, and the convoy has yet to reach the terminal. Now, some say this was enough time. If the terrorists were ready, they could have began the executions. They could have thrown grenades. They could have tripped any explosives they had, or they could have started shooting. So the time it takes from when the first bullet is fired without a silencer to get to the terminal, there is a little bit of time, and maybe because of mass confusion, maybe the middle of the night, we don't exactly know, but the terrorists don't indeed start executing hostages right at that moment. So, kind of a miracle, if you will.
Yeah. Obviously, that mishap leads to all hell breaking loose, and a huge firefight goes on. They had sort of strategically planned to attack a couple different locations. They had, from information from some passengers, they knew that where some of them were sleeping, so they knew they needed to sort of clear both areas. When they come in, obviously the terrorists have heard, the hijackers have heard this gunfire, so they're sort of going to be ready, guns blazing for them. I think one of the interesting things is that obviously this plays a key role, is that they're not able to sort of get a description of like who is friend or foe, because unfortunately one of the Israelis, in one of the documentaries, they actually interview his father. One of the Israelis dies, and he dies because as soon as he sees the people coming, he jumps up, thinking that he's jumping up because he's a terrorist, and he was jumping up because he's like, yeah, you're here to save me. It's sort of like what they did when Idi Amin came in, and he unfortunately dies.
They got excited, yeah.
Yeah, that was sad. That was very sad.
Yeah. But they are able to kill 7 of the terrorists. 3 of them, however, the Palestinians, so they kill the 2 Germans. The 3 of the other Palestinians, including one of the masterminds, Wadi Haddad, he escapes through some exit of the terminal. But in 1:45 seconds, they secure the lounge area.
Yeah.
They pretty much have the hostages under wraps, but there is a firefight with the Ugandan soldiers in the control tower. And unfortunately, trying to create a protective corridor for the hostages to get escorted out back to the runway, Yoni Netanyahu, the leader of the mission, is hit, and he is down. He will die in the course of the mission and go down a hero in the memory of all Israelis. To keep the mission moving, they need to refuel, because this is really interesting. They didn't have a refueling plan besides being in Entebbe. They were working diplomatic channels to get approval by Kenya to refuel there. That way they can get out of Entebbe quicker. And that agreement only comes through while they're on the ground. So they're blowing up these Russian MiGs, these planes and jets that the Ugandan army has, just in case on the way out they're able to scramble. If the Ugandans are able to scramble the jets, they won't be able to get out of there safely. So they blow the jets. They get the go-ahead to land in Kenya. So they, as quick as they can, take off on the C-130s, got all of the remaining hostages, and it was only 53 minutes after landing, the first C-130 lifts off, including the hostages and, unfortunately, the lifeless body of Yoni Netanyahu.
Luckily, only 3 of the hostages were killed during that, right?
Yep, and Yoni was the only soldier. So they get to Nairobi, successfully refuel, and by 3 a.m. while they're in the air, the BBC finally transmits the success of the rescue mission to the world.
Yeah, I'd say it's pretty successful. It's pretty crazy.
It's a wild story.
Like, when I'm reading all this stuff and watching these things, I'm like, how the heck did they pull this off?
Right. It's crazy, man. I mean, they were, from the time the plane was hijacked, it was 6 days and 22 hours.
Yeah, because it's like, I wonder how much time, or if any, they were able to practice like the assault on the airport. Because you think of like our raid on Bin Laden, they were able to practice like thousands of times that raid, and it still didn't go off without, like, you know, the helicopter obviously crashed. You know, it still didn't, like, you know, practice obviously doesn't, you know, mean anything when you're on the field. But the fact that
is adaptability more important than preparation?
I think so. Well, you know, they're both. I think you need both.
They're both, yeah. But that's another thing with Rap, right? He has a perfect blend of both.
Oh, yeah.
He knows everything, thanks to Stansfield, Kennedy, and the crew, and Marcus. He won't go into a mission unless he knows enough. But he also is aware of the areas he doesn't know, or when he's going to have to adapt, and pulls that off perfectly. So this just seems like a mission. If you told me Rap was Yoni right here, minus a few kind of flaws, I would have been like, absolutely, I would buy that.
Yeah, like, to bring this all back to Mitch Rapp and our story, you know, this is very much a Mitch Rapp style of a mission. I feel I could see him easily, you know, leading this through, you know.
So let me ask you, if we were going to say 1 through 10, I know, obviously, in separation of power, it's not a hostage rescue attempt.
Right.
I know it's not an African dictator and all this stuff, but this idea of disguising yourself as, you know, a real general would travel, knowing how to blend in using these limousines, knowing the convoy would be able to get past certain barriers. How likely do you say it is that Vince directly and knowingly was drawing on Operation Thunderbolt and inspiring him as he crafted the Baghdad scene?
I don't know. I'd probably have to say like a 7 or an 8, because I guess if he really was, because Vince is pretty historically, he'll reference previous, like, real life missions.
Yeah.
So part of me thinks that there's so many parallels between this, because I was trying to like look for other missions that were like this, and I couldn't find any. I mean, I'm guessing people have thought of, like, you get in, you pretend, and you get out. Like, that's, you know, kind of a common thing. But just the whole idea of dropping a limo, driving in, pretending you're a general, getting out, like that, it's very, very similar. So
yeah, I agree. I'm going very likely. I think he's just too well versed in this stuff, and I think that's the mark of a good author, to say, I can be inspired by the real world events, but I'm going to make it my own story. And so Vince does that. And I mean, history is often more badass than, anyone's imagination, right? So no problem drawing on history and then crafting it to make your own story. So I was a big fan of this scene, both what Vince did and just the fact that we can have these connections and these discussions. Yeah. Good literature.
Very good literature.
Let's do a little review here, because as you can tell, we've been talking about a lot of different sources. We want to tell you so that you can enjoy these films, and we want to share a little bit more about our final thoughts on where we got some of this research from. So, Chris, you referenced the documentary. What exactly was that called so listeners can find it?
Right. So if you look on YouTube, there's actually a couple versions of this Nat Geo documentary. I watched sort of half of the older version and all of the newest version. It's one of the, I think, episode 9 in one of their seasons. It's free on YouTube. Both of them cover this Entebbe Hostage Rescue. Both of them are interesting because the older one, they actually have an interview with the pilot from that flew had a gun pointed to his head flew in the Air France flight. In the newer one, they interview the wife of the guy whose badge we mentioned, the badge we had to eat up, as well as a younger guy who actually his mom, we forgot to mention this, his mom got sick and they took her to a hospital.
Yes.
And he had to make a decision: do I stay? Do I go? He ended up she wouldn't want me to die, and actually, it's unfortunate. As Idi Amin was really pissed off about it, he commanded his forces to go find her as soon as he found out that this happened, and then to kill her. So
she disappeared at the Ugandan hospital she went to.
Yeah. And then the older one, they had an interview with actually Netanyahu. So yeah, I would recommend both of them. They're both sort of 45 minutes. Obviously, the newer one has better video quality. So yeah.
And cool animations. The National Geographic one from Situation Critical series had some pretty cool mock-ups of the old terminal and some digital recreations of the mission. So that was cool.
Yeah, and the dramatization wasn't overly cheesy.
So yeah, those were two of the movies I watched. The old one got pretty good reviews on IMDb. It was around, I think, a 7. It was from 1977. It was originally, I believe, an NBC television premiere. And, we're talking less than a year after the events. So that one is free on YouTube, and it's just over 2 hours, which is kind of wild, watching something that old over 2 hours, and it still had my attention. It has Charles Bronson. He plays one of the generals working with Yoni to lead the mission. And they do a pretty good job, I would say, as far as we know, sticking to the true story. And if you watch this one, it had a really great Idi Amin. The Amin scene of him showing up in the airport, talking to the hostages, it just sticks with you. His performance there.
Shalom, shalom. Shalom, shalom.
The newer movie from 2018 called 7 Days in Entebbe, it's a much more modern representation of the events. It's still based on a true story, but they are taking a lot more artistic creativity and it's much more modern representation, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and it was interesting. Like, I see the cover of it. This was before I even knew what the Operation Entebbe was about. And on the cover of this movie, I was like, oh, we should watch this one. It's a new one. And it's got Daniel Brühl. I don't know, I can't pronounce the German. And Rosamund Pike on the cover. I was like, oh, sick. I like both of them. Yeah. And then come to find out they're the two German terrorists. And I was like, oh, great. They're going to die.
Well, yeah, I think they did a phenomenal performance. So I really liked this one. I went in with low expectations. Reviews. Yeah, I went in with really low expectations because the older one from the 70s got great reviews. It was really lauded. And this one had like a 5 on IMDb. And people were trashing it.
Let me look up the Rotten Tomatoes.
Rotten Tomatoes, I think, was in the 50s. I think it's like 54 or something.
It might have been even in the 40s.
Yeah, people were crapping on this one, but I really ended up liking it. And I think the comments were about two things. There's this artistic flair. I don't want to say too much, but they try to weave in this interpretive dance scene to the narrative of the story and some people felt it interrupted the action. I thought it was artistically done, and I'm not somebody to like all those critics, movies. Anytime critics rave about a movie, I'm like, oh, it's going to be some artistic piece of junk, and I don't really care. But this one, the artsy side of it came through all right for me. The trailer made it look amazing. I thought it was great. I don't know why people are trashing it on Rotten Tomatoes.
No, it actually has a 24 on Rotten Tomatoes. Sorry.
Are you serious?
Yeah, it has a 24. That's not a
24?
So you were mentioning also that it could just be people, because that's the fan score. People having problems with Israeli-Palestine relations. Dramatization of that.
I think so. And this one obviously is a success story on the Israeli side. It is a rah-rah defeat the terrorists, kind of movie. So I think people did trash it for that. The other thing is some people felt in the comments they were too sympathetic to the Germans, because the Germans over and over in this movie were showing how they didn't want to hurt anybody. They wanted to do it. They were raw, right? They wanted to do it for this revolutionary zeal, this communist takeover, support the liberation of the Palestinians. And the movie kind of sympathized with them, like coming up against real life. Like, you want to sympathize with a cause, but that cause means taking and risking and threatening people's lives. And so the movie is playing with the Germans kind of not regretting what they did, but having to see the consequences of their actions and maybe questioning themselves. And so maybe people thought they were too sympathetic with the two German terrorists. I don't know. That definitely came through.
I could see that. But I don't know. It's $4 on Apple
Amazon
downloads.
Rental.
Yeah, Amazon Rental, whatever. So
I don't usually pay to rent movies with how much free stuff you can get. This one was a good night in. This was a good $4, rent a movie, have a night in. I really liked it.
If you really want to dive into Idi Amin, though, I would recommend spending the $4 on Last King of Scotland. So
yep, definitely gonna do that.
You had to choose because it's on Cinemax right now.
Oh,
but Cinemax got rid of their app, so I ended up paying for it because I didn't want to watch it on my laptop. So, anyways,
gotcha. Well, for free, I'd recommend the 1977 Raid on Entebbe. That's on YouTube for free, and I think it does edge out the modern dramatization by just a little. I think it was better in the end.
Yes.
Cool. Well, this was fun. Something a little different, huh?
Yeah, this was nice. Fun talking about like historical events that, probably are inspired or rooted in and very similar to stuff that we talk about with the Mitrab books. So,
and I mean, we're just two dudes drinking beer talking about books on a podcast. We're not really that. Well, you're a scientist. I'm a history teacher. We don't have that much credentials to talk about military operations, but
no.
We give it our best shot, and we're just here to have fun, and hopefully you're learning a little bit of something.
Yeah, hope so.
Cool. All right, Chris, so what are we doing on the next episode? We're bringing back the author series, right?
Right, yes. So we got author series for October. So we got you something a little bit different here. It's nonfiction. We got in touch, actually, he got in touch with us. It's a former CIA employee who heard us do a review on the Showtime film The Spy Masters back when we did The Third Option. And he was like, hey, that movie was about former Central Intelligence directors. And he's like, hey, I worked for most of those people. So you want me to come talk to you? And actually, he has a book, and it's called The Protected. And it's a rare look into the professional realm of, executive protection from personal accounts of someone who has dedicated over 30 years of his life to protecting others. So, yeah, this guy's like, he protected a bunch of people.
Yeah. And I was thinking about this interview right when we read Lethal Agent. Remember that weird scene where Mitch becomes a bodyguard for a chapter in Lethal Agent?
Yeah, that was an interesting scene. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was like, this guy is the professional who quite literally wrote the book on executive protections and, personal protection. And I'm reading Lethal Agent, and Mitch Rapp is sitting outside a hotel room door guarding, what was it, like a K-pop star? Like some Korean teen
I think it was
pop
supposed
star?
to be the equivalent of like Justin
it was like
Bieber.
A Justin Bieber. Yeah. I don't know where I got the Korean
Kristen
thing.
Stewart or something like that. I don't know.
And then Rapp is supposed to be the bodyguard, but he hears him like abusing her in the hotel room. And, Coleman is like, you can't do anything in the world of personal protection. We don't get involved in domestic disputes or, what goes on inside the hotel room. But Rapp's like, F that. He busts in and beats the shit out of this kid. And he's like, don't touch her. And so I was thinking like, man, being a bodyguard is pretty wild. Even Mitch Rapp got to do it, although he's probably not very good at the actual job. Well, he's probably really good at the job protecting, but he's not good at interfering if he's protecting a jackass.
Right. Which I feel like most people who get protection are probably jackasses. I shouldn't say that, but.
Well, anyway, we talked to Mike Trott, who's a professional in the field, former CIA employee, and he actually is a Mitch Rapp fan. So he tells us a little bit about his favorite Mitch Rapp books. So we'll be bringing that to you next week.
Yep. And we want to take this time to thank our patrons, including our special operator, Sherry F., our special agents, who are Matt, Dawn, Dennis, Peggy, Catherine, Ray, and Jeff. We can't say this enough. Please subscribe, rate, and review us using your favorite podcasting platform. You can find us online at mitchrappod.com or using our Twitter handle at mitchrappod, as well as on Insta. And as always, just let Mitch be Mitch. Just a disclaimer, this podcast is not affiliated with Vince Flynn, Kyle Mills, or Simon & Schuster, but thank you to them for bringing us the wonderful world of rap. And the music soundtrack is Guerrilla Tactics by Raphael Crooks.